The sands of Egypt remember everything. The wind shifts across the desert and exposes bones, fragments of gold, and the stones that once held the weight of gods. For over 3,000 years, the pharaohs ruled this land, half men, half divinities, and their lives were shaped by a single obsession: eternity. To be born into the royal house of Egypt wasn't a blessing. It was a summons. The moment a royal child took its first breath, priests whispered that a god had entered a body. The child didn't belong to its mother anymore, or to the living world. It belonged to the machinery of eternity. Royal nurseries were quiet, sterile, and filled with the smell of incense. Servants fanned the air not to cool the baby, but to keep demons away. Priests traced protective symbols on the cradle. A pharaoh-to-be wasn't allowed to cry. Crying invited spirits. Everything was ceremony, even hunger. As the child grew, tutors taught language, ritual, and the complex theater of divine kingship. They weren't trained to think like ordinary humans. They were told day after day that the sun itself rose at their command. You can imagine what that does to a person's ego or their sanity. The crown prince's mornings began with prayer, purification, and a breakfast that could have fed a village. Honey bread, figs, roasted goose, wine water just enough to keep him dignified. Every gesture was symbolic, each mouthful blessed, each glance rehearsed. Because in Egypt, performance was power. The gods were believed to notice everything. A wrong ritual could anger the heavens. A single misspoken word in a ceremony might bring drought or flood or plague. The life of a pharaoh was a never-ending exam before the divine. And it wasn't easy pretending to be perfect. Behind the golden masks and the formal poses on temple walls were real people, jealous, anxious, and often terrified. Pharaohs lived in palaces filled with eyes: priests, scribes, servants, guards, spies, and wives. Every one of them waiting for a sign that the living God had faltered. A sneeze during a ritual might be taken as a bad omen. An eclipse could start a political crisis. The line between superstition and politics was thin enough to vanish. And so the pharaohs learned to act. They moved through their lives like actors in a play written thousands of years before they were born. Even their bodies were public property. Each gesture, each hairstyle, each piece of jewelry carried cosmic meaning. A missing amulet or an unpolished toenail could offend the gods. The stakes were that high, and so the royal life became a performance, perfect on the outside, unbearable within. Many pharaohs turned to magic for comfort. Magic was not forbidden, it was part of life. Spells were carved into walls, written on papyrus, even painted on furniture. Charms against scorpions, diseases, betrayal. One of the most common was the spell against loneliness, chanted before sleep, because even gods got lonely, especially gods trapped inside gold palaces where no one dared speak freely. In theory, the pharaoh could have anything he desired. In practice, he was surrounded by fear. No one laughed near him. No one touched him casually. To touch the body of the divine ruler was to risk your life. So imagine living in that kind of isolation, adored by millions, but unable to be human. At night, the palace quieted. Servants retreated to the courtyards. Priests murmured in the distance, and the pharaoh sat beneath oil lamps that hissed softly as the wicks burned down. He might read a scroll or listen to music, harps, flutes, soft chants. Sometimes he would stare at the statues of his ancestors and wonder if they ever felt the same weight. They did. For all their grandeur, the pharaohs were prisoners of their own eternity. Every decision was filtered through ritual, every emotion through fear. They were told they would live forever, but they couldn't risk a cold without a priest panicking about omens. Still, Egypt demanded perfection, and the pharaohs played their roles. Some loved the power, others drowned in it, but all of them shared one fate: to die as gods and live forever in stone. The irony, of course, is that they succeeded. Thousands of years later, we still whisper their names. Before the first pyramids scraped the desert sky, before anyone carved the face of a god into stone, there were just small river villages and men who called themselves blessed. They stood at the edge of the Nile during its floods and claimed that the water rose because they had spoken to it. No one could prove otherwise, and the crops were good, so the people believed. From belief came power, and from power came the first crowns, little more than reeds twisted together. The earliest rulers of Egypt were not yet pharaohs. They were intermediaries, translators between the human and the divine. The people saw in them the same magic that guided the river, a steady rhythm that promised life. They learned quickly that power was not in the sword, but in the symbol. A man who could convince others that his breath was the wind of the gods had no need to fight for obedience. He simply needed to stand still and let others kneel. Over centuries, these river kings grew more ambitious. Their crowns of reeds became bands of copper, then gold. They wrapped their words in ritual, and their bodies in linen, dyed with rare minerals. Their names stretched into poetry, each one an attempt to sound less human. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the joining of the red and white crowns, was not just a political act. It was myth-making in real time. The king was now the living horizon where heaven met earth. He became a bridge, a physical representation of the impossible, a mortal who could command the sun. But divinity is a difficult performance. Once the people start calling you a god, they expect miracles on schedule. Floods must come exactly when they're needed. The sun must rise with the precision of an accountant. A single drought, and the same mouths that praised you will whisper that you have angered the heavens. So the early kings surrounded themselves with priests who could read omens, astronomers who tracked the stars, scribes who wrote the future into stone. If the gods failed to act, the court made it look as if they had. Every success was divine confirmation. Every failure was an interpretation problem. The pharaoh didn't invent propaganda, he perfected it. To the farmers, he was the river. To the soldiers, he was the storm. To the priests, he was the living vessel of order, Ma'at embodied. His image appeared everywhere, his name repeated like a spell until it no longer felt like a name at all. Even the shape of the temples was designed to reinforce the illusion. You entered from the harsh glare of the desert into deeper and deeper darkness until you reached the inner sanctum, where a single statue of the pharaoh stood glowing in lamplight. He was the sunrise trapped in stone. In truth, he was only a man, sweating, aging, occasionally terrified. But the system didn't allow for humanity. Once you accepted the crown, you ceased to belong to yourself. You became the vessel of Egypt, a breathing symbol wrapped in linen and expectation. The earliest pharaohs probably understood that the gods were inventions of necessity, but they also understood something more dangerous. Inventions can outlive their creators. So they built. They dug canals, raised temples, and called it devotion. They carved their names into stone, not because they believed in eternity, but because they feared being forgotten. Every monument was a confession. I was here, I mattered, remember me. And somehow, thousands of years later, we still do. If the pharaoh was a god in human form, then the priests were his mechanics. They kept the divine machine oiled, chanting, and vaguely believable. Without them, the illusion of eternity would collapse before breakfast. Egyptian priests didn't merely pray, they managed reality. Every sunrise, they woke before the rest of the city to perform what looked like worship but was closer to maintenance. They entered the temple barefoot, heads shaved, bodies scrubbed with salt water and natron until not a speck of dust remained. They were not allowed to smell of sweat or garlic or anything remotely mortal. At dawn, the high priest approached the statue of the god. He spoke to it as though it were alive because to the Egyptians, it was. Overnight, the divine presence was thought to have withdrawn, and it was the priest's job to coax it back into the stone. The ceremony was elaborate. He opened the shrine, lit incense, washed the statue with sacred water, dressed it in linen, and anointed it with oils imported from places so far away they might as well have been myths. He presented food, small loaves, onions, beer, and then promptly removed them, because no one believed a stone figure could actually eat. The food would later be distributed to the temple staff. Nothing went to waste, not even holiness. Every action had to be precise. If the wrong hand was used to lift the incense, if a word in the chant was mispronounced, the balance of Ma'at could falter. The Nile might not rise. The crops might fail. A foreign army might appear at the border. Imagine living with that kind of pressure before breakfast. Priests served in rotations a few months at a time, then returned to ordinary life, marriage, farming, trade, before being summoned again. It was a strange sort of double existence, half bureaucrat, half sorcerer. You might be calculating taxes one month and embalming sacred ibises the next, but the higher you climbed in the temple ranks, the less human life you were allowed. The high priest of Amun, for instance, could rival the pharaoh in power, but had to live in near total seclusion. He could eat only certain foods, touch only purified tools, and speak only words sanctioned by the temple scrolls. By night, the temples were silent, except for the low chanting of the watch priests. They carried oil lamps through the colonnades, light flickering across hieroglyphs that glowed like living things. Some believed the gods moved through the halls at that hour, inspecting the work, judging devotion. Outsiders rarely entered. The temples were the heart of the state, filled with treasures, scrolls, and secrets too sacred or too politically inconvenient for ordinary eyes. When new rulers took power, they rewrote the rituals to fit their image, sometimes chiseling out the names of older gods to carve their own. Eternity was surprisingly easy to edit with a hammer, but even the priests, with all their discipline, had moments of doubt. Droughts came, plagues spread, and they found themselves whispering the same questions the farmers did. Are the gods still listening? Are we still heard? Their answer was always the same ritual. When the world began to feel uncertain, they doubled the prayers, tripled the incense, built another temple. In Egypt, faith was not about understanding. It was about repetition. To keep the heavens turning, someone had to keep chanting. The kingdom of Egypt wasn't ruled by armies or politicians. It was ruled by belief. The pharaoh didn't sit atop a throne made of gold. He sat atop an idea, that he was the bridge between earth and sky. Every dawn was his responsibility. When the sun rose, priests sang hymns to remind the world that it was the pharaoh's divine energy guiding it. When the Nile flooded, they said it was his breath that had filled the river. If crops failed, well, that was his fault too. Divinity came with terrible customer service. This belief wasn't just superstition, it was a political masterpiece. By convincing millions that their king was a god, the state became self-sustaining. Every farmer, every scribe, Every soldier believed their daily work kept the universe balanced. Disobedience wasn't rebellion, it was cosmic treason. At the center of it all sat the pharaoh, both adored and trapped. The palace was less a home than a sacred labyrinth. Guards lined the corridors, walls shimmered with gold leaf, and everything, from the air to the architecture, was meant to remind you that you were inside a god's house. Even the floors were carved with protective spells, just in case an evil spirit tried to sneak in through the soles of a servant's feet. Visitors approached the pharaoh like petitioners to a volcano. You didn't look him in the eye. You prostrated yourself, recited a memorized greeting, and waited for permission to speak. A single misstep could mean exile or death. To outsiders, this looked like majesty. To those inside, it was suffocation. Every word the pharaoh spoke was recorded, every gesture repeated by attendants. He was never alone, not even when bathing. The royal bath itself was treated like a ritual: special oils, sacred herbs, chants to purify the divine flesh. If the water was too cold, someone could die for it. There's a story from the late New Kingdom of a young pharaoh who tried to live simply. He dismissed half his attendants, ordered the court musicians to stop playing at breakfast, and even walked barefoot in the palace gardens. The priests panicked. They claimed the gods were offended by such humility. A month later, a divine message appeared on a temple wall in carefully carved hieroglyphs, declaring that the gods required more offerings and stricter ceremony. The young pharaoh obeyed. He died before 30. Power in Egypt wasn't something you possessed, it possessed you. Beneath the glamour of the throne lay endless politics. The priests of Amun, the scribes, the viziers, all had their own factions, their own secrets. The temples were more powerful than most armies, and the pharaoh had to appease them constantly. Gold flowed through the temples like blood through veins. Offerings, tributes, taxes, bribes, all in the name of the gods, which really meant the priesthood. The divine order was an expensive illusion, and the pharaoh was both its sponsor and its captive. When the ruler sneezed, the empire trembled. When he smiled, songs were written. But when he died, chaos waited like a crocodile beneath the surface. The transition from one god-king to the next was the most dangerous time in Egypt. Succession was supposed to be smooth. The divine essence simply moved from father to son. In reality, it was a blood-soaked gamble. Brothers turned on brothers. Queens plotted in the shadows. Generals whispered of omens and conspiracies. The walls of Thebes and Memphis had seen more than one convenient accident in the royal family. Some pharaohs didn't even make it to the throne. Others wore the crown for days. A few were so erased from history that their names were literally chiseled off monuments, a fate worse than death in a culture obsessed with eternity. The Egyptians had a word for that: damnatio memoriae. To be forgotten was to die twice, so they built bigger temples, carved deeper tombs, and filled them with their own names, hoping to outlast the whispers. They wanted immortality. But immortality always came at a price. And the deeper you dig into the lives of the pharaohs, the clearer that price becomes. Madness, paranoia, and a life lived in golden isolation. Each pharaoh believed he was chosen by the gods. None of them could escape being devoured by their own divinity. The crown of Egypt was more than decoration. It was a spell made visible. To wear it was to invite lightning. Every color, every curve, every feather meant something sacred, and the weight was not just metal. It was expectation, myth, and millennia of superstition pressing down on a single skull. There were many crowns, each one a personality. The white crown of Upper Egypt, tall and slender, symbolized the unbroken flow of the Nile. The red crown of Lower Egypt, squat and spiraled, represented the swampy delta. When Egypt was unified, the crowns were combined into one, the Shent, a double-layered symbol of dominion over both life and death, order and chaos, papyrus and lotus. It looked impressive, but balancing it required neck muscles of steel and the patience of a saint. Gold circlets, cobra ornaments, falcon wings, jeweled ribbons, all of it gleamed in the sun. To modern eyes, they were dazzling. To Egyptians, they were alive. The serpent on the crown, the uraeus, wasn't mere ornament. It was a divine weapon, said to spit fire at enemies who looked upon the pharaoh with malice. The cobra goddess Wadjet was always watching, her flared hood poised to strike from the edge of royal brows. Before a new crown was worn, it had to be awakened. Priests purified it in incense smoke, rubbed it with oils, and recited hymns to summon the divine presence inside. The ceremony was equal parts religion and stagecraft, and the stakes were cosmic. If done correctly, the crown turned the king into something unassailable. If done poorly, he was just a man pretending to be a god, and that never ended well. The goldsmiths who made these crowns worked in near silence. They didn't merely craft jewelry, they built divine machinery. Every hammer strike was a prayer. The tools themselves were sanctified. Some were buried with their owners when their work was done, because even touching them might carry residual divinity. Imagine one of those smiths in his workshop. The heat, the flicker of the furnace, the thin hiss of molten gold poured into clay molds. He's not thinking about fashion, he's thinking about eternity. He's shaping something that might outlast the pyramids, something that must look perfect under the unblinking eye of the sun. When the crown was finished, it was placed on an altar, not a head. The pharaoh approached it like an acolyte before a god. Even he, divine ruler, had to show humility to the symbol that defined him. The moment it touched his scalp, he ceased to be mortal. And that transformation, terrifying and exhilarating, was never private. The coronation was a spectacle. Trumpets made of silver, incense clouds thick as mist, the chanting of hundreds of priests, their voices rising and falling like the breath of the Nile. The crowd of thousands pressing against the temple walls, straining to glimpse the living sun on earth. But what no one saw was how heavy the crown really was. Beneath the jewels and glory, it dug into the skin. Every bead of sweat reminded the ruler that divinity was uncomfortable. The price of eternity, it turned out, was neck pain and paranoia. When night came and the ceremonies ended, the pharaoh removed the crown and stared at it in the lamplight. The gold caught the flame, gleaming like a living eye. And somewhere inside, he must have wondered who was truly ruling whom. The crown was supposed to make him a god, but sometimes gods become prisoners of their own symbols. The pharaohs didn't invent the idea of image control. They just made it religion. Every inch of Egypt's surface, from the walls of temples to the handles of spoons, became a billboard for eternity. The message was simple. The pharaoh is order, and everything else is chaos. There was no such thing as casual art. A statue wasn't decoration, it was a statement of metaphysical truth. If the sculptor carved the king's jaw too softly, it wasn't merely a bad likeness, it was heresy. Every line had to whisper strength, calm, divine certainty. Even wrinkles were forbidden. Time itself had to obey. Artists, scribes, and architects worked under constant supervision from priests. The official style remained unchanged for centuries. When you see 1,000 pharaohs all standing stiffly, 1 foot forward, arms to their sides, that wasn't laziness. That was ideology. That posture meant control, power, permanence. The human body as an emblem of cosmic balance. Realism was dangerous. If a pharaoh's portrait looked too mortal, too human, it might remind the people that he could bleed. So instead, they perfected the ideal. You could walk into a temple built 1,000 years after the first pyramids and see the same frozen smile staring down at you. The propaganda works so well that even archaeologists thousands of years later still call that face eternal. But propaganda in Egypt wasn't limited to art. The pharaoh's name itself was a spell repeated endlessly. Scribes wrote it on temple walls, tomb ceilings, statues, amulets, obelisks. His titles stretched across paragraphs: Lord of the Two Lands, Son of Ra, Beloved of Maat, Eternal in Splendor. Every repetition reinforced reality. To erase his name was to erase his existence. That's why damnatio memoriae, destroying a ruler's name, was the ultimate revenge. Chisel out the hieroglyphs, and you killed him in both worlds. The stone went silent. Eternity blinked. The priest could chant for 1,000 years. But without a name, the soul had nowhere to land. The system even extended into myth-making. Battles that ended in stalemate were inscribed as triumphs. Enemies were depicted fleeing in terror, their faces conveniently anonymous. Gods were shown personally handing the pharaoh his weapons. When famine struck, the inscription spoke of plenty. When rebellion flared, the relief showed unity. Truth was negotiable. Divinity was not. Inside the royal workshops, artisans lived and died for this illusion. They were sworn to secrecy, forbidden to reveal what the pharaoh actually looked like without his divine makeup. The court employed cosmetic priests, yes, that was a real title, who painted the ruler's face for ceremonies using crushed minerals and sacred oils. His eyes outlined in kohl, his skin dusted with gold powder. He was transformed into something luminous and inhuman. Even his movements were rehearsed. When he walked through the temple, he did so slowly, evenly, as though gravity itself bent politely out of the way. Everything was theater, but theater that people believed. And perhaps the greatest trick of all was how well it worked. The peasants plowing the fields believed they were laboring for a god. The scribes believed they were recording the deeds of a deity. Even the pharaoh himself, after years of bowing to his own statues, began to believe the script. That's the paradox of divine kingship. Build an illusion big enough, and sooner or later, you start to live inside it. Every monument, every hymn, every slab of carved stone hummed with the same refrain. The king is eternal. The world depends on him. And as long as those words were spoken, the spell held. The royal palaces of Egypt were cities within cities, sealed worlds of order and fragrance and ritual. From the outside, they looked serene. White limestone walls, banners fluttering. Lotus ponds reflecting the sun, but inside everything was choreographed down to the smallest movement. Even silence had a place in the schedule. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and blue lotus, burned from sunrise to sunset. Servants walked barefoot so their steps made no sound. Every surface gleamed: polished alabaster, gilded furniture, floors scrubbed with salt water and milk. Nothing was allowed to appear mortal. The pharaoh's morning began with purification. Before he could be seen by anyone, attendants would anoint his skin with sacred oils, a blend of cedar, frankincense, and a touch of cinnamon. His nails were cleaned with golden picks, his eyelids painted with kohl to protect against evil spirits and glare from the desert sun. Breakfast was a ritual, not a meal. Dishes were brought on bronze trays: honey cakes, dates, roasted quail, figs soaked in wine. Each was tasted first by a food tester because poison was an ancient Egyptian hobby. Then came the petitions, scribes reading requests from nobles and merchants, reports from generals, omens from priests. The pharaoh listened in silence while eunuchs fanned him with ostrich feathers. If he spoke, every word was copied onto papyrus, sealed, and stored in archives. Even his sighs were considered politically relevant. Outside his chambers, the palace pulsed like a living creature. Dozens of servants polished bronze doors that already shone. Musicians rehearsed hymns for ceremonies that might never happen. Courtiers practiced the appropriate angle of bowing. The women of the royal household, queens, princesses, and favored consorts, drifted through gardens of pomegranates and lilies, trailed by perfumers and guards. They weren't prisoners exactly, but they lived inside a system of etiquette so dense it might as well have been a cage. The queen herself would only speak to her husband during specific hours. Even laughter required permission. And then there were the rumors. Palaces bred stories the way tombs bred silence. Some said royal servants were buried alive to guard their master's secrets. Others whispered of musicians who vanished after a performance, their last notes echoing through marble halls. Reality was probably less dramatic and somehow worse. Servants could be executed for mishandling a garment or letting the pharaoh's shadow fall on them by accident. The court was filled with spies loyal to rival factions. Even a misplaced compliment could be interpreted as treason. Every day was theater, every gesture rehearsed, every smile political. The pharaoh, meanwhile, bore the loneliness of command. The only people who could speak to him freely were his high priests, and even they filtered their words through ritual. The divine ruler had no friends, only servants who pretended friendship out of fear. At night, the palace transformed. Torches glowed, harpists played slow melodies. Dancers moved like shadows through the courtyards. The pharaoh sat surrounded by gold, his face hidden behind serenity. Some nights he called for his astronomers. Together they climbed the palace roof to watch the stars drift over the desert. Egyptians believed those lights were the souls of past kings sailing the sky. Maybe the pharaoh found comfort in that. Or maybe he saw his own destiny up there, glittering and silent. Beneath the beauty, the palace was a machine. A golden, grinding, holy machine built to turn one human life into a symbol of eternity. And all machines, no matter how divine, wear down. Egypt's rulers didn't just build monuments, they engineered immortality. Each block of limestone, every column of sandstone was part of a grand experiment in defying decay. The pharaoh's true masterpiece was not his reign, but his tomb. The concept of a house of eternity wasn't poetic. The Egyptians genuinely believed that architecture could outwit death. The tomb wasn't a memorial, it was an operating system for the afterlife. Walls were manuals, ceilings were constellations, corridors were veins through which the soul might travel. Everything had a function, even the silence. At the heart of it all was a fear so vast it became sacred, the fear of being forgotten. That's why the pyramids rose from the desert like frozen suns. To the modern eye, they seem like relics of ambition. To their builders, they were survival mechanisms. If the body rotted, the tomb would remember. If the name was erased, the stones would whisper it. Consider the precision of it all. The Great Pyramid at Giza is aligned so exactly with true north that compasses might as well take notes. Each side faces a cardinal direction. Each chamber has astronomical significance. The shafts were not random air holes. They pointed toward the circumpolar stars, which never set, symbols of eternity. Even in death, the king wanted to rise among the undying. But the pyramid was only the beginning. Later, pharaohs realized that giant beacons of gold and limestone tended to attract thieves. So they moved their tombs underground, carving entire cities of death into cliffs and valleys. The Valley of the Kings became an inverted metropolis, a maze of corridors spiraling toward eternity. Walking through one of those tombs today is like stepping inside someone's dream. The walls shimmer with color, still bright after 3,000 years. Cobalt blues, ochres, and gold leaf catching flashlight beams like sunlight on water. Gods parade across the plaster in formal processions. Hieroglyphs stretch in endless rows, instructions, prayers, passwords for the underworld. Everything in those passages had meaning. The ceiling, painted with stars, told a soul where to go. The floor, covered in ritual scenes, reminded it what to avoid. Even the sarcophagus was carved from a single block of stone because separation to the Egyptians meant danger. Every crack was a weakness, every imperfection, an invitation for chaos to creep in. And the workers who built these tombs, they lived like ghosts long before they died. Hidden in isolated villages like Deir el-Medina, they worked under secrecy, guarded by soldiers, sworn by oath. They were paid in beer and bread, occasionally in wine, and sometimes in silence. When they grew old, their hands were twisted from the hammer's grip. But they knew their names would never be inscribed in the tombs they built. Their immortality was anonymous. Despite the grandeur, even the pharaohs could not stop time. Many tombs were looted within decades. Treasures vanished, mummies desecrated, walls scarred by greed. And yet somehow the architecture itself survived. The intention of eternity proved more resilient than the gold it guarded. Today, the pyramids still catch the dawn exactly as they did when the first stone was laid. Their angles still echo the light of a sun that has risen and fallen over 100 billion times. Eternity, it turns out, might not need magic after all. Just mathematics, stone, and a little human stubbornness. Behind every glittering crown and divine decree was a small army of people who made the illusion function. The pharaoh's absolute power only looked effortless because thousands of servants, scribes, guards, cooks, and courtiers moved in choreographed obedience to keep him glowing like the sun. These servants lived in a world of ritual. Every morning before the pharaoh even opened his eyes, his attendants began the awakening of the living God. The chief valet entered first, bowing so deeply his forehead touched the floor. Perfumed oils were heated, linen garments unfolded. The ruler's first breath of the day was met with whispered hymns. Then came cosmetics. Yes, even kings had morning routines. Kohl around the eyes, ochre across the skin, gold dust in the hair. The pharaoh didn't dress himself. That was unthinkable. Each layer of clothing represented an aspect of the divine. The linen tunic symbolized purity, the jeweled collar symbolized cosmic order, and the sandals, made from papyrus reeds, were meant to trample chaos itself. Outside his chamber, a queue formed. Petitioners, priests, generals, and bureaucrats waited their turn to bow and mumble the same phrase: life, prosperity, health. They weren't just being polite. Those three words were a spell, reinforcing the idea that his existence sustained the world. If the pharaoh sneezed, a priest somewhere probably blamed a disruption in Ma'at, the universal balance. Royal life looked comfortable, but it was a cage lined with silk. Every movement was monitored, every meal tasted. The palace itself was a hive, scribes copying orders, servants scurrying with trays, guards standing motionless in the heat. The pharaoh's voice carried through halls painted with scenes of his own glory. Imagine sitting down to dinner and being surrounded by 40 versions of yourself, smiting enemies. Subtle, it was not. The meals were absurdly lavish. Bread flavored with honey and coriander, roasted duck, figs, dates, and jugs of beer. Music floated through the halls, flutes, harps, soft chanting. Yet the ruler was rarely left alone. Even his dining companions were chosen for symbolism. The high priest to represent faith, the general to represent strength, the queen to represent fertility. Every bite, every glance was part of a performance. There were darker sides too. Royal servants often lived and died within palace walls. Some were eunuchs, trusted precisely because they could have no family ambitions. Others were enslaved foreigners, war captives rebranded as gifts from the gods. For them, the pharaoh's divinity was not an abstract belief, but a daily ordeal. Still, for many, serving the king was the highest honor imaginable. To polish the sandals of a living god was better, they thought, than being forgotten as a farmer. They might never see their own names carved in stone, but they were part of something eternal. And then when the ruler died, loyalty took a more dangerous shape. Servants were expected to follow him, not metaphorically. Some tombs contain the skeletons of attendants who appear to have been killed or entombed alive, their remains arranged in careful order near the king's sarcophagus. The afterlife apparently required a full staff. It's easy to romanticize ancient Egypt as a world of wonder, but for those servants, eternity could come far too soon. Egyptian art lied beautifully. The pharaohs we see on temple walls stand tall, smiling, youthful, invincible. The truth behind the stone was stranger. Real pharaohs aged. They limped, coughed, lost teeth, and suffered sunburn like everyone else. But that could never be shown. Artists were forbidden to depict weakness. So the sculptors carved the eternal version, the divine mask that never changed, even when the man beneath it was dying. In private, they aged brutally. Archaeologists studying royal mummies found arthritis, obesity, abscessed teeth, and broken bones from childhood accidents hidden under wrappings. The living gods were fragile creatures, wrapped in linen lies long before they reached their tombs. The cosmetic rituals only delayed the decay. Kohl for the eyes, henna for the hair, perfumed oils for the skin. Daily attempts to deny mortality. The irony wasn't lost on the priests who applied them. They were preparing the pharaoh for the afterlife before he'd even left this one. Divinity also demanded performance. Every public appearance required days of preparation. Costumes sewn with real gold thread. Collars encrusted with turquoise and lapis lazuli, heavy enough to bruise the shoulders. The crowns themselves could weigh several kilograms, pressing down on the skull like a halo of metal. Under all that splendor, a man sweated, blinked, and prayed not to faint. The image mattered more than comfort. The gods didn't perspire. The gods didn't tremble. The gods didn't collapse under the desert sun. So neither did he. Yet sometimes cracks appeared. There are records of pharaohs retreating mid-ceremony, claiming divine visions or sudden illness. The truth might have been exhaustion, dehydration, or panic. No one dared say. The priest quickly wove new myths to explain the moment. Everything had to remain sacred, and so, layer by layer, reality vanished under theology. The pharaoh became a living statue. He smiled when told to smile, wept when the gods required it, and pretended eternity wasn't crushing him. But eternity has sharp edges. Power in ancient Egypt wore perfume. Behind the marble stillness of the pharaoh's image were women who steered politics, whispered in chambers, and decided which petitions reached the throne. Some were queens, others concubines, priestesses, or mothers. But all of them lived in a palace where beauty was currency and silence could be fatal. The great queen might seem untouchable in reliefs, tall, serene, eternally youthful. But in life she navigated a web of jealousy sharper than a scorpion's sting. Royal wives were ranked in hierarchies that made court politics look like a chess match played with real blood. The great royal wife sat beside the king during ceremonies, while lesser wives and harem women competed for glances, gifts, and gossip. Every smile was strategy. Many of these women were not Egyptian at all. Marriages were political treaties sealed with eyeliner and incense. Princesses from Nubia, Mitanni, or Syria arrived on river barges heavy with dowries and confusion. They spoke new languages, ate unfamiliar food, and learned quickly that their primary duty was to produce an heir who looked convincingly divine. Life inside the royal harem was equal parts luxury and paranoia. Gardens with pools of lotus flowers, servants bearing sweet wine, musicians playing soft rhythms on lutes. And behind all that, constant surveillance. Guards at every door, eunuchs recording who visited whom, priests performing fertility rituals that were as much about control as spirituality. The harem wasn't a den of pleasure so much as a gilded waiting room for destiny. A woman who bore a son could rise overnight from obscurity to power. A woman who failed might disappear into the quiet margins of history. One whisper, one accusation could undo everything. Poisoning attempts and plots weren't rare. Some are recorded in court documents that read like early crime thrillers. The most formidable of them all, though, were the royal mothers. A king might rule Egypt, but his mother's name carried a shadow of that power. Statues show queens standing beside their sons, not behind them. Equal in size, sometimes even larger. They weren't subtle about influence. They arranged marriages, exiled rivals, and occasionally reigned themselves when sons were too young or too distracted by divinity. Hatshepsut, for example, didn't bother waiting for her son to grow up. She simply put on the pharaoh's headdress, strapped on a false beard, and ruled Egypt in her own name for 20 years. Official inscriptions called her His Majesty herself. The gods, it turned out, could be flexible with pronouns. But even for powerful women, the afterlife offered little equality. Queens were buried near their husbands, yes, but rarely in tombs of equal grandeur. Their names faded faster, their temples smaller, their faces more easily recarved. Eternity, like everything else, was a patriarchy with better lighting. Still, there was something subversive in their endurance. Centuries later, when archaeologists opened the tombs and found the painted faces of these queens, the colors were still vivid. The reds of lips, the blues of wigs, the gold of jewelry. They stared back across 3 millennia as if to say, "We were here too." And they were. In the candlelit corridors of the palace, beneath the chants and the politics, it was often women who held the rhythm of Egypt together, the pulse beneath the throne. Worship looks beautiful from a distance, incense, song, the slow rhythm of reverence. But to be its object is something else entirely. The pharaoh was called the good god, the lord of the 2 lands, the son of Ra. His name was spoken like a prayer. Statues of him filled every city, painted in perfect health, eyes wide and eternal. But for the man himself, all that devotion could feel like standing beneath an avalanche made of silence. When the ruler appeared in public, the crowd fell prostrate. No one dared meet his eyes. Even nobles bowed so low, their foreheads touched the ground. It was respect, yes, but it also stripped him of any real connection to another human being. You can't talk honestly with people who believe you caused the sunrise. The palace priests reinforced this distance. They told him that every breath he took was sacred, that his blood glowed with the power of Ra. To question them was blasphemy. To believe them was madness. So the pharaoh balanced somewhere in between, trapped between worship and loneliness. Ceremonies consumed his days. There were rituals for harvest, for the Nile's flood, for the birth of sacred animals. He attended them all, even when exhausted or ill. Sometimes he had to perform a blessing while covered in gold dust, standing under the open sun for hours, smiling through heat that could melt wax. At night, when the servants retreated and the corridors fell quiet, that divine isolation became unbearable. The pharaoh might summon musicians or storytellers, or his favorite wife just to hear a human voice unfiltered by fear. But even those moments carried formality, every word still wrapped in reverence. Priests whispered constantly about signs from the gods. A strange dream, a sudden storm, a scarab crawling across a statue. All could be omens. The ruler's mind became a battlefield of superstition. Should he sacrifice more animals? Build another temple? Was this illness punishment? Was this success a warning? No decision felt purely his own. The gods were everywhere, watching, waiting for the smallest mistake. And in that paranoia, strange habits grew. Some pharaohs filled their chambers with protective amulets. Others ordered their beds moved daily to confuse spirits. There's a record of one who never slept in the same room twice for fear that demons were counting his breaths. It's easy, centuries later, to laugh at that. But imagine knowing every cough might be interpreted as a sign that the world was ending. Some rulers sought comfort in philosophy. Others drowned it in excess. Gold cups, imported perfumes, feasts that lasted for days, anything to dull the feeling of being divine and alone. And when death came near, that same fear deepened, because the pharaoh was expected not just to rule Egypt, but to continue ruling it from beyond the grave. The living God was supposed to die without dying, which meant his final years were spent rehearsing for eternity. When the pharaoh feasted, it wasn't dinner, it was liturgy. The table was an altar, the wine was sacred blood of the vine, and every bite affirmed the divine right of a man pretending not to notice that everyone around him was terrified of chewing too loudly. Banquets in ancient Egypt were explosions of sensory theater. The air shimmered with incense and oil lamps, gold reflecting on polished limestone walls. The musicians began softly, harps, flutes, drums the size of wine jars. Servants moved like choreography, balancing trays of roasted goose, dates, and honey cakes glazed so perfectly they looked like miniature suns. The guests were arranged according to a logic only the royal protocol scribes could decipher: priests near the head of the table, generals within arm's reach of the guards, and foreign dignitaries strategically placed just far enough from the wine to avoid loose tongues. The pharaoh's seat was elevated by a platform, literally a throne atop a table, so he could gaze down upon the mortals feasting in his honor. Conversation at such events was delicate. You couldn't just ask, "So, how's the war with Nubia?" Every sentence had to acknowledge the divine nature of the host. Most guests opted for safe topics like praising the Nile, the weather, or the smoothness of the pharaoh's skin. Some flatterers even wrote short poems in his honor to recite between courses. The line between diplomacy and stand-up comedy was razor thin. The food itself reflected Egypt's agricultural genius. The fertile Nile Valley provided everything: wheat, lentils, onions, garlic, figs, grapes, pomegranates. Fish from the river were marinated with coriander and cumin. Beef was rare, reserved for temples or royal tables. Bread was everywhere, baked in hundreds of shapes, some stuffed with dates or nuts. Beer flowed like water, Though the elite preferred wine imported from Canaan or Cyprus, decanted into alabaster jars that cost more than the peasants who harvested the grapes. And the entertainment. The Egyptians were masters of spectacle. Dancers performed barefoot on polished floors, their movements half ritual, half temptation. Acrobats twisted into impossible shapes, while trained monkeys handed guests grapes and stole jewelry when no one was looking. Sometimes the pharaoh himself participated in small gestures of benevolence, offering a cup of wine to a favored guest, or nodding in amusement at a clever riddle. That nod could change a man's life. Yet beneath all the gold and laughter lay the heavy hum of politics. Every toast, every seating arrangement, every glance was loaded with meaning. The general seated too far down the table might suspect he'd fallen from favor. The priest offered extra wine might wonder whether it was a bribe or a test. Egypt's most elegant evenings were often preludes to coups. When the feast ended, guests were escorted out one by one, leaving behind half-eaten loaves and cooling meats. The musicians' final notes lingered like smoke. Servants swept up flower petals, extinguished torches, and whispered prayers to clear the lingering energy of so many lies politely told. Then came the cleanup no one witnessed, the high priest entering to purify the space, sprinkling natron water while muttering spells to banish envy. Even the gods, it seemed, preferred to keep politics off the dinner table. To the common people outside the palace, these banquets became legend. They imagined the king eating with the gods themselves, bathed in eternal firelight. And maybe for a few brief hours, he did. Because for the Egyptians, the difference between feasting and worship was mostly a matter of seating arrangement. Every royal death began years before the body stopped breathing. The tomb builders started early, digging deep into the cliffs, carving passageways filled with stars, gods, and promises. The pharaoh's architects knew exactly how long eternity would take, about 30 years of labor, a few thousand artisans, and mountains of limestone. The tomb wasn't a memorial, it was a machine designed to cheat death. In its deepest chamber, the sarcophagus waited, red granite polished until it gleamed like blood under torchlight. Priests filled the walls with spells so the dead king could navigate the afterlife safely, avoiding crocodile-headed demons, knowing which gates to speak to, which gods to flatter. The most powerful pharaohs were buried with literal libraries of magic. Hundreds of papyrus scrolls sealed inside the tomb, each describing a step of the journey through the underworld. But building a tomb this grand attracted trouble. Greed has good hearing. The Valley of the Kings wasn't a secret. Bandits, even priests, robbed graves within decades. The same workers who carved those sacred halls sometimes returned later at night, guided by memory and hunger, prying gold from the fingers of the gods. And the living king knew this. He could see it happening to his ancestors' tombs. Imagine the terror, to spend your whole life building eternity, only to realize eternity had a break-in problem. So the pharaohs got clever. False doors, hidden chambers, curses carved into walls. Psychological warfare against future thieves. One tomb even contained a decoy burial chamber filled with worthless trinkets, meant to satisfy robbers and protect the real body deeper below. The most famous of these insurance policies were the curses, short inscriptions designed to frighten anyone who disturbed the tomb. Death shall come on swift wings to he who disturbs the peace of the king. A simple threat, but effective enough that even modern archaeologists hesitate before reading it aloud. The Egyptians believed words themselves had power. To carve a curse was to give it teeth, and yet despite all the protections, most tombs were violated. The eternal pharaohs turned out to be very temporary gods. But even robbed, even broken, they achieved something miraculous. Their names still echo. We still whisper Ramses, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut. We still imagine their golden faces glowing in the dark. They wanted immortality, and in a crooked, beautiful way, they got it. The pharaoh's bed was not just a place for rest, it was a battlefield of gods. When the ruler of Egypt closed his eyes, he didn't drift into peaceful sleep. He entered a world where the stakes were cosmic. Each dream was treated as a message from the divine, a glimpse behind the curtain of eternity. Which sounds poetic until you realize those messages were often terrifying. Egyptians believed dreams were doorways. Through them, the soul could wander the duat, the shadowy realm of the dead, and return with visions of truth or warning. That was a beautiful idea for a priest. For a pharaoh, it was exhausting. Every night could bring an omen that required interpretation, sacrifice, or the sudden building of a temple to appease whichever god had shown up in his subconscious. To prepare for sleep, the pharaoh's attendants performed a ritual known as banishing the lurking one. Candles were lit, amulets arranged around the royal bed, incantations murmured to keep hostile spirits from slipping through. The bedposts themselves were carved with protective hieroglyphs, tiny guardians standing eternal watch. Still, dreams came. Some were flattering, visions of the sun god Ra embracing the king, or of the Nile overflowing in gratitude. Others were grotesque. Accounts survive of rulers dreaming of serpents with human faces, or rivers running backward. One pharaoh dreamt of the temple statues walking away from him, their eyes blank. The priest did not love interpreting that one. For the ancient Egyptians, dreams were not metaphor, they were data. There was an entire profession of interpreters of dreams who kept dusty manuals listing symbols and their meanings. Dream of eating crocodile meat, prosperity. Dream of falling into water, imminent loss. Dream of losing teeth, someone in the household would die. The king's dreams, however, were state secrets. Scribes recorded them on papyrus, locked in archives only high priests could access. And yet, sometimes a dream could change history. Thutmose IV, for example, supposedly slept near the half-buried Sphinx and dreamt the great lion-headed god promised him the throne if he cleared away the sand. He did, and became king. The dream stela he erected between the Sphinx's paws still stands, an eternal advertisement for the power of sleep. But the darker dreams haunted more than they inspired. Imagine the ruler of the world, lying awake in linen sheets embroidered with gold, staring at the ceiling and wondering if his own gods were plotting against him. If a single dream foretold rebellion, he might purge half his court by morning. If a vision promised victory, thousands of soldiers marched to their deaths. The weight of prophecy pressed heavier than the crown. Nightmares were blamed on demons, snakes, crocodiles, spirits of the unburied dead, and on false gods, chaotic entities that whispered lies. Priests created amulets shaped like tiny knives to protect the pharaoh's dreams. Others placed small wax figures of enemies beneath the bed, pierced with pins so their spirits couldn't intrude. It's a strange kind of comfort, falling asleep above a collection of cursed dolls. By dawn, the king would awaken, bleary-eyed, and immediately summon interpreters to decode whatever visions had survived the night. The results could lead to decrees, offerings, or public ceremonies meant to rewrite the dream's outcome. Sleep wasn't rest, it was policy. And yet sometimes, the dreams were quiet. A walk through a garden that didn't exist. A conversation with a long-dead parent. the sound of water lapping at the edge of eternity. Even gods, it seems, were haunted by what they dreamed. If there was one thing the Egyptians refused to separate, it was science and sorcery. Healing a body and protecting a soul were just two sides of the same cosmic coin. The pharaoh's physicians were as much magicians as they were doctors, scribes who mixed honey with holy words and linen with incantations. The royal court employed dozens of them: surgeons, dentists, herbalists, embalmers, each trained in temples where medicine was considered a form of worship. The House of Life, and as these temple schools were called, stored scrolls listing remedies for everything from snakebite to heartbreak. Some sound surprisingly practical: honey for infection, willow bark for pain, basically aspirin, garlic for stamina. Others read more like attempts to outwit chaos with style. To drive away a headache, tie a clay crocodile on your head and recite the names of the gods. The pharaoh's body was the blueprint of the state, so any illness was treated as a national emergency. If the divine flesh showed weakness, the whole cosmic balance wobbled. Priests examined his pulse, read his dreams, offered amulets, and occasionally prescribed things like milk of a woman who has borne a boy, or ground ostrich shell mixed with beer. No one dared suggest rest. Gods apparently didn't get sick days. But the Egyptians were not fools. They practiced early surgery, draining abscesses, setting bones, stitching wounds with linen soaked in resin. Mummies show evidence of healed fractures and dental fillings. Their understanding of anatomy came not from study of the living, but from centuries of experience with the dead. When your civilization spends 3,000 years perfecting mummification, you get very familiar with human insides. Mummification itself was medicine for eternity. The process was meticulous, reverent, and a little grotesque. The embalmers began by removing the brain through the nose with a hooked tool because they believed thoughts came from the heart. The organs were carefully extracted, dried with natron salt, and sealed in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The body was stuffed with resins, oils, and herbs, then wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, sometimes enough to cover a small pyramid. Each layer was accompanied by chants to restore the senses. May your eyes see again, may your mouth speak, may your limbs move. The goal was not to preserve beauty, but to preserve function. A withered body was fine, as long as the spirit could still recognize it. For a pharaoh, the process could take up to 70 days, overseen by high priests wearing jackal masks in honor of Anubis, lord of embalming. They worked by torchlight in rooms thick with the scent of resin and smoke. The only sound was the scrape of knives and the murmur of ancient prayers. The end result was astonishing. A body lighter than it looked, stiff but elegant, glistening with oils and wrapped like a sacred gift. When it was finally sealed in its sarcophagus, it wasn't seen as a corpse. It was an immortal engine, ready to operate in the afterlife. To modernize, mummification can seem like morbid superstition. But in a world where decay was the enemy and eternity the prize, it made perfect sense. The Egyptians looked at death the way an engineer looks at a machine that simply needs maintenance. And somewhere in the hush of a tomb chamber, surrounded by the scent of cedar and the shimmer of gold, a priest whispered the final spell: "You shall not rot, you shall not perish, you shall live forever." 3,000 years later, those words have held remarkably well. In the silence of the tomb, the Egyptians believed death was only an intermission. The real story began after the last breath, the soul, or rather the Ka, the Ba, and the Akh, because a single Egyptian couldn't be contained in one soul, rose from the body like a bird. It didn't drift off to paradise immediately. It had to prove itself. The afterlife was bureaucracy on a cosmic scale. First came the journey through the Duat, the underworld. It wasn't fire and brimstone, but a vast, confusing landscape filled with gates, serpents, and lakes of darkness. To pass each obstacle, the soul had to recite spells, passwords, and hymns written on tomb walls. Miss one, and you wandered forever. At the end of this long road stood the Hall of Judgment, gleaming with impossible light. There sat Osiris, the god of resurrection, surrounded by 42 minor deities, each holding a question and a feather. The deceased was led before them by Anubis, the jackal-headed god who weighed the truth of every life. The ceremony was elegant and terrifying. The heart of the pharaoh was placed on a golden scale. On the other side lay the feather of Maat, goddess of truth and balance. If the heart was heavier, weighted by lies, greed, cruelty, it was thrown to a creature called Ammit, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. The soul was devoured, erased forever. If it balanced perfectly, the pharaoh entered Aru, the field of reeds, a serene version of Egypt itself, the Nile forever green, the sun forever gentle, the harvest endless. The pharaoh would live there as he had on earth, ruling, farming, feasting, but without hunger, pain, or politics. It sounds peaceful, but for the living ruler preparing for it, it was pure anxiety, because eternity depended on reputation. Every bad decision, every famine, every unpopular decree could haunt the pharaoh's soul forever. To be remembered as unjust was worse than death. The people's faith literally built his afterlife. So he built temples, fed priests, raised monuments taller than imagination. The stones themselves were insurance policies, each carving of his name, each hymn sung in his honor, all of it evidence to present before the gods. It wasn't vanity, it was legal paperwork for eternity. Even the smallest rituals had cosmic weight. If the embalmer whispered the wrong word during mummification, the entire spiritual machine might fail. So the process was slow, sacred, and almost surgical. The brain removed through the nose, the organs stored in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The heart, the seat of the soul, left inside the body, because you'd need it for the weighing. Perfumed linen, layer after layer, wrapping the royal corpse until it no longer resembled flesh, but an idea. Gold amulets slipped between bandages, spells painted on toes and fingers. The face finally covered with a mask of beaten gold, shining, eternal, inhuman. When all was done, the priest sealed the tomb and spoke the opening of the mouth ceremony. The statue of the pharaoh was touched on the lips with a ritual blade, so his spirit could speak and eat in the afterlife. Then the doors closed, silence returned, and the living God was gone. But death in Egypt never ended quietly. Long before the printing press or the internet, Egypt had a class of people who controlled truth with ink and reed pens. They were the scribes, thin, sharp-eyed men who could make or unmake reputations, record miracles, or erase existence with a single stroke. To the common farmer, they were more frightening than soldiers. To the pharaoh, they were indispensable. Writing was sacred work. The Egyptians believed hieroglyphs were not symbols but living beings, the breath of the god Thoth trapped in ink. Each curve of a bird or flick of a snake on papyrus carried power. To write a name was to summon it. To erase one was to kill it. That's why every scribe began his day by dipping his pen in water and murmuring a short prayer. May my words endure. The training was brutal. Young apprentices spent years copying lines until their wrists ached and their backs hunched. The reed pen is your father and mother, their teachers told them. Slaves lifted stones, peasants tilled the fields, but scribes bent over desks for eternity. Yet this suffering came with immense privilege. Literacy was rare, and the ability to write placed a man closer to the gods than to his neighbors. Inside palace offices, scribes worked in quiet rows like human printing machines. Their tools were simple: a palette of black and red ink, a reed pen, a roll of papyrus. Black was used for ordinary text, red for divine names, warnings, and corrections. The result was both art and documentation: contracts, decrees, hymns, tax records, love letters, all written in the same deliberate hand. But the most trusted scribes served the pharaoh directly. They recorded his speeches, victories, and even his dreams. They edited history in real time. If a battle went poorly, they wrote it differently. If a project failed, they simply stopped mentioning it. It was a kind of propaganda powered by calligraphy. These royal scribes were both bureaucrats and mystics. They calculated taxes in the morning and copied spells for immortality by night. When they described the pharaoh smiting enemies, they believed the act of writing it made it happen. Words were not reflections of reality. They were reality. Some scribes became legends in their own right. One famous example, Imhotep began as an architect and writer under Pharaoh Djoser. His talent was so revered that later generations literally deified him as a god of wisdom and healing. It's hard to imagine an accountant becoming a deity, but Egypt had a habit of rewarding good penmanship. For all their piety, scribes had a wicked sense of humor. On the backs of papyri filled with solemn texts, archaeologists have found doodles, cats playing harps, donkeys dressed as judges, pharaohs with exaggerated noses. Even eternity, it seems, gets boring after a few thousand tax receipts. Still, they knew the gravity of their craft. When they sealed royal decrees or inscribed a tomb, they were writing for eternity. They carved letters deep enough to outlast sandstorms, sun, and empire. Many of their words have. When we read their inscriptions today, those tight rows of symbols marching along tomb walls, we are hearing voices that refuse to die. The pharaohs built pyramids to survive time. The scribes, with nothing more than reed and ink, managed the same trick. In the end, it was the scribes, not the kings, who wrote Egypt into immortality. The moment the tomb was sealed, the empire began to worship the dead. Temples rose in his honor, festivals marked his passing, and offerings were made to sustain his soul. The priests claimed to speak with him in dreams. Farmers left bread and beer at roadside shrines. The new pharaoh, meanwhile, inherited not only the crown, but the ghost of the old one. Each ruler lived in the shadow of his predecessor, sometimes literally, since new temples were built beside old ones. To fail was not just political, it was spiritual treason. Egypt became a kingdom of memories. Every generation added new gods, new rituals, new pharaohs to its pantheon. Over centuries, the divine rulers blurred together into a single, endless cycle of birth, power, death, and resurrection. To live forever, you had to be remembered. To be remembered, you had to be extraordinary or terrifying. Some rulers leaned into cruelty to make their names unforgettable, others into beauty. A few, like Akhenaten, tried to rewrite religion entirely. He replaced the old gods with a single one, the sun disk Aten, and made himself the high priest of light. It was a bold experiment in monotheism that ended badly. After his death, the temples of Aten were torn down, his name erased. The divine sun had burned too bright, and so the old order returned. The gods were many again, the priests powerful, the rituals endless. Egypt survived not through innovation, but through obsession. Even as the centuries passed and dynasties crumbled, the image of the pharaoh remained eternal, calm, perfect, untouched by time. But the truth behind that mask was fragile, human, and afraid of the dark. If the pharaoh's tomb was a palace for eternity, then the men who carved it were its invisible architects, the ghosts of the living world. They built temples for gods they'd never meet and sealed kings they'd never touch, all while living in the shadow of cliffs that swallowed generations whole. Their village, Deir el-Medina, was hidden in a barren valley west of Thebes. It wasn't much to look at. Rows of mud brick houses, narrow alleys, a well, a tiny temple. But this was no ordinary workers' camp. The men here were artisans, painters, stonemasons, and scribes, handpicked for their skill and loyalty. They were paid with bread, beer, and rations of meat, luxuries by Egyptian standards. Their job was to make sure the king never truly died. Every morning, at sunrise, the work crews filed into the cliffs like a daily resurrection. The sun blazed overhead while they chipped, painted, measured, and prayed. In the confined tunnels, the sound of hammers echoed like a heartbeat. The air stank of sweat and crushed pigment. Light came from flickering oil lamps, smoke curling up to kiss the carved ceilings. Each worker had a role. The quarrymen cut the chambers. The draftsmen sketched the gods in red ink. Painters followed, layering blues, greens, and golds with brushes made from reeds and cat hair. Scribes added hieroglyphs that would speak forever in the dark. When a mistake was made, a line too crooked, a symbol misplaced, they didn't erase it. They recited spells to silence the error, turning even a slip of the hand into ritual. Life in Deir el-Medina was strict, but not joyless. They had families, gardens, and even small pets, dogs, cats, occasionally monkeys. Children grew up learning to paint lotus blossoms and draw the faces of gods. At night, the men drank beer, told stories of ghosts in the desert, and gossiped about which official had been caught stealing copper. They were craftsmen, but also chroniclers of their own lives. Some even left graffiti on the cliffs. Pasht, servant of the tomb, made this in year 40 of the king, a small rebellion against anonymity. Their community was literate, rare for the ancient world. They kept detailed records, complaints, ration lists, even notes of strikes. Yes, the first recorded labor strike in history happened here. When the government failed to deliver food rations, the workers put down their chisels and marched to a nearby temple, demanding payment. Their message was simple: even eternity runs on lunch. But the work itself was dangerous. The tunnels sometimes collapsed. The heat was relentless. Accidents were common, and superstition filled the gaps left by medicine. They carried charms shaped like the eye of Horus, muttered prayers before striking stone, and avoided working on unlucky days marked by the priests. And still, when the final tomb was sealed, they were forbidden to speak of what they'd seen. The layout, the treasures, the secret passages, all were state secrets guarded by the threat of death. They returned to their modest homes knowing they'd built something glorious they could never claim. Centuries later, thieves would plunder the tombs they made, but their names, carved in the margins, survived. The king's bodies were moved, robbed, forgotten. The workers' graffiti remained. It's a strange irony. The men who labored to immortalize gods ended up outlasting them. No kingdom lasts forever, even one built by people who thought they'd already conquered death. The pharaohs had spent thousands of years carving eternity into stone, yet time was patient. It waited while the Nile silted up, while priests squabbled over offerings, while one young ruler after another sat on a throne that no longer glittered quite as brightly. You could trace Egypt's decline not through its wars, but through its tombs. Early kings were buried in mountains of stone that touched the sky. Later dynasties settled for smaller pyramids, than secret valleys. The walls of those tombs still glowed with color, but the gold was thinner, the spells copied instead of written by masters. Each corner of the empire whispered the same thing. The divine line was tired. By the time of the later dynasties, the pharaoh was more politician than god. He performed the old rituals, but the crowds no longer truly believed. People bowed because tradition demanded it, not because they feared lightning from the heavens. Even the priests, the eternal keepers of faith, had learned to hedge their bets. They kept shrines to old gods, new gods, foreign gods, just in case. The kingdom of Osiris had become a spiritual marketplace. The real power drifted quietly away, like sand in the wind. Generals, scribes, merchants, mortals began to run what was once divine. Egypt's borders weakened. Foreign armies came not to worship, but to plunder. The living gods discovered that they bled just like everyone else. When the tomb of a pharaoh was looted, it wasn't always the work of foreign thieves. Sometimes it was Egyptians themselves digging into their ancestors' graves for gold. The irony was almost cruel. The riches meant to secure eternal life were the very things that erased it. Still, the Egyptians kept burying their kings, kept painting the walls, kept whispering prayers to the sun. Hope is hard to extinguish, even when history keeps proving it wrong. One day, a new kind of ruler came to power. He didn't call himself a god, only a man. His people spoke Greek. They built cities of marble beside the old temples of sandstone. They loved the myths, but not the faith. The old priests still tended the sacred fires, but their eyes had grown dim. The pharaohs had become stories told by candlelight, and maybe that's all they ever were. Stories too big to stay alive, but too beautiful to die completely. Tombs were supposed to last forever. That was the whole point of the exercise. Spend decades building an underground palace. Stuff it with gold, food, perfume, and prayers, and then trust the gods and your guards to keep it safe until the end of time. Time, however, has terrible manners. It doesn't knock before entering. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt began almost as soon as the tombs were sealed. For all the pharaohs' boasts about divine protection, gold is gold, and hungry men are easily persuaded by the promise of it. Entire gangs formed out of the same laborers who built the tombs. Who else knew where the passages lay, where the false walls hid, where the sarcophagus waited in its chamber of painted silence? The government knew it too. Officials set up tomb police, which sounds impressive, until you realize most of them were poorly paid and easily bribed. There are surviving records of trials in which thieves calmly listed which guards helped them break in. Justice, as always, moved slowly when gold was involved. Some of the robberies were crude, smashing through walls, hacking open coffins, leaving trails of linen and resin behind. Others were almost surgical. Thieves melted wax to silence their tools, crawled through ventilation shafts, and cut out amulets without disturbing the wrappings. One papyrus describes them melting gold off mummy masks by firelight, whispering prayers as if to apologize. And it wasn't only criminals. Even the priests got involved. During times of famine or political collapse, temple officials quietly recycled the wealth of the dead. They stripped jewelry, melted statues, and reburied the bodies in plain coffins. The gods would forgive them, they reasoned, if it kept the temples running. Morality bends easily under hunger. In a strange twist, the desecration of tombs led to one of Egypt's great archaeological miracles. When the priests reburied royal mummies to protect them from thieves, they placed dozens of pharaohs together in secret caches, hidden chambers deep in the cliffs. These resting places were forgotten for millennia until locals stumbled upon them in the 19th century. That's how we met the faces of Seti, Ramses, And Thutmose again, their wrinkled skin still wrapped in linen, their names still readable after 3,000 years. Each robbed tomb tells two stories, one of reverence betrayed, another of inevitability. You can lock the doors of eternity, but eternity has thieves. And yet, for all that loss, something remains. When archaeologists unseal a chamber and light touches those colors again after ages of darkness, it feels less like a theft and more like a return. The art still speaks, the walls still breathe. The pharaohs wanted immortality through gold. What they got instead was memory. And perhaps that's the truer kind. Centuries passed. The desert swallowed everything. Wind and sand erased names, toppled columns, buried whole cities. The gods fell silent. But silence is never final in Egypt. Thousands of years later, men in hats and linen shirts arrived with shovels and notebooks. They dug where the old world slept, brushing away the dust of ages. And suddenly the pharaohs were alive again, reborn not through magic, but through curiosity. Every statue, every hieroglyph, every golden coffin pulled from the sand whispered a fragment of the same story. We were here, we mattered, we dreamed of eternity. In a strange way, they got what they wanted. The living gods who ruled over the Nile are now remembered everywhere. Their faces are printed on museum posters. Their jewelry glows under glass. Their curses and legends fill books and documentaries. People still whisper their names before sleep. The irony is exquisite. The pharaohs failed to live forever in flesh, but they succeeded in myth. Their afterlife wasn't the field of reeds. It was human memory. And maybe that's the truest kind of immortality. Because long after their temples crumbled and their tombs were broken, we still speak of them, still stare at the gold, still wonder what it felt like to be worshipped, to be trapped inside divinity, to live every day knowing death was waiting, polishing his crown. The desert keeps its secrets. There are still tombs undiscovered, chambers sealed, names erased waiting to be spoken again. Somewhere beneath the dunes, another pharaoh dreams of eternity, his heart resting on the scale, still hoping to balance the feather. The sand shifts, the wind hums across ancient stone, and the night deepens. Egypt sleeps, but never quite rests.